And when researchers opened a centuries-old tomb in rural Japan, they expected to find something traditional, perhaps the remains of a monk or samurai. But instead, they uncovered a mummified body with genetic markers that pointed far away from Asia. What was Western DNA doing in the body of a person who lived and died in isolation in Japan hundreds of years ago? The truth, as they would learn, rewrote more than just one life story. In a remote mountain temple in northern Japan, during routine preservation work in the 1970s, monks stumbled upon something unexpected, a sealed wooden chamber hidden behind a weathered altar. Inside, sitting upright in a lotus position, was a human body, legs crossed, hands folded, eyes gently closed beneath shrunken lids. The skin was tightly drawn over bone, the robes perfectly intact. It was a Sokushinbutsu, a self-mummified monk, preserved by a centuries-old ritual of fasting, meditation, and slow death. Carbon dating would later place the remains to the late 1600s, in the height of the Edo period, a time when Japan had sealed itself off from the outside world. But it wasn't the preservation that stunned researchers. It was the genome. When scientists conducted mitochondrial DNA analysis on tissue samples, they expected to confirm East Asian haplogroups typical of the region. Instead, they found something that didn't belong. Genetic markers most commonly associated with Western Eurasian populations, found thousands of kilometers away. Was it contamination, a lab error, or something far more perplexing? What was Western DNA doing in a Japanese monk's body, untouched for over 300 years? As scientists dug deeper, the truth would unravel a forgotten story, one that crossed oceans, religions, and generations. The initial DNA results sent ripples through the scientific team. The mummy's mitochondrial haplogroup, inherited solely from the maternal line, belonged to a type rarely, if ever, seen in East Asia. Specifically, it aligned with haplogroup H, a genetic lineage most prevalent in modern-day Europe and the Middle East. No markers typical of Japanese or East Asian populations appeared in the mitochondrial sequence. At first, researchers suspected contamination, but strict lab protocols had been followed and cross-checks came back consistent. The DNA had come from the mummy's own cells. To add another layer of contradiction, skeletal analysis of the skull, pelvis, and femur showed features consistent with East Asian morphology. The question grew more urgent. Who was this man? Was he a foreigner who somehow entered Japan during its tightly controlled isolationist era? Or had genetic mixing occurred earlier than historians realized, hidden in the cracks of time? Researchers turned to history for answers, and clues began to surface. During the Nanban Trade Period, starting in the mid-1500s, Japan had brief and intense contact with the outside world. Portuguese and Spanish missionaries, sailors, and traders had made their way into the islands. Christianity spread. A few Europeans settled. Some even intermarried with Japanese locals. But here's where the twist unraveled the theory. The burial context of the mummy predated most of these interactions. The tomb had been sealed decades before widespread foreign contact took hold. So how could a man buried deep in rural Japan, before significant Western influence, carry the genetic imprint of Europe? It wasn't just a biological anomaly. It hinted at a forgotten migration, or an even older entanglement of worlds. The discovery raised more than genetic questions. It challenged how we understood Japan's past. To find the roots of this Western DNA, scientists turned to a chapter in Japanese history that most textbooks condense into a footnote, the Nanban Trade Period. Beginning in 1549, Jesuit missionaries led by Francis Xavier arrived on Japanese shores, bringing Christianity, firearms, and European ideas. The response was mixed. In coastal regions, Christianity spread quickly. Some daimyo or feudal lords even converted. In Nagasaki and Kyushu, European priests lived among the Japanese, teaching doctrine, building churches, and, on rare occasions, fathering children. Historical records confirm a small number of intermarriages between European settlers and Japanese women. Sailors, shipwreck survivors, and even rogue traders sometimes vanished into the Japanese countryside, their stories lost to time. So one theory began to form: could the mummy be the descendant of such a union? A child born of two worlds, raised in Japan, perhaps hidden from rising anti-Christian sentiment, and later drawn to the ascetic life of a monk? Some of these converts, after all, had been persecuted as Christianity was banned under the Tokugawa shogunate. By the early 1600s, Japan had closed its borders and foreign bloodlines were forced into silence or extinction. But then, the timeline clashed again. Carbon dating of the mummy's tomb pushed its sealing back to the late 1500s, before the height of European-Japanese interaction. Even if the man were a second-generation descendant of a missionary or sailor, it would have required unusually fast generational turnover to fit the burial period. That's when researchers looked deeper, far deeper. Could this anomaly be something even older? Some scholars had long speculated that Japan's ancient Jomon people, who lived over 10,000 years ago, might have distant genetic ties to Western Eurasia. There had been unconfirmed findings of non-East Asian haplogroups in ancient remains, but these were dismissed as statistical noise. Now that noise was beginning to sound like a signal. The debate escalated in the academic community. Was this case a rare fluke, a single outlier that defied odds, or evidence of a forgotten migration across the northern routes, across Siberia or the Pacific Rim, bringing traces of Eurasian DNA long before recorded contact? If so, the man in the tomb wasn't just a monk. He was a biological bridge, a silent record of human movement across continents, preserved in the folds of his robes and written in the spiral code of his genes. To resolve the mystery once and for all, scientists moved beyond mitochondrial DNA and conducted full genome sequencing on preserved soft tissue and bone samples. What they found was unmistakable. The man had between 30 and 40% Western Eurasian ancestry, far too recent to be a distant relic of prehistoric migration. This wasn't a faint trace passed down through millennia. It pointed to a parent or grandparent of European origin. The implications were extraordinary. To verify the biological findings, researchers turned again to the body itself. Skeletal features, particularly the facial bone structure, jaw angle, and tibial curvature, were reanalyzed using modern forensic models. The proportions were consistent with mixed ancestry, aligning with profiles seen in biracial individuals of East Asian and Southern European descent. Then came the final clue. In a forgotten archive from a Jesuit mission in Nagasaki, a handwritten report surfaced. It mentioned a child, born of foreign blood, left at a local temple by a Japanese woman after the father, a sailor, disappeared at sea. The note included no name, only a vague location, a mountain province, several days' travel north. The timing? Late 1500s. The location? A near match to the region where the mummy had been entombed. The story, long buried in both stone and silence, had finally come full circle. The man was likely the child of a European sailor and Japanese mother, born into a culture that barely tolerated his existence. Taken in by monks, he lived a life of austerity, discipline, and perhaps spiritual refuge. In death, he chose a path followed by only the most devout. Sokushinbutsu, the self-mummification ritual meant to transcend the body. His body became preserved in ritual, but his identity, hidden in bone and blood, took centuries to uncover. In life, he may have felt like a contradiction, a child of two worlds in a society built on unity and conformity. In Edo period Japan, bloodlines mattered. Belonging meant everything. For someone visibly different with foreign roots, the path was narrow, perhaps even invisible. We'll never know his thoughts, but we can imagine what it meant to grow up on the margins. A face slightly different, a past whispered about but never spoken aloud. Whether accepted by the monks or merely sheltered, he eventually chose the only identity no one could question, that of a spiritual seeker. His decision to undergo Sokushinbutsu, the ritual of self-mummification, was not just about faith, it was about transcendence. A slow death chosen deliberately. A way to leave behind not just the physical body, but perhaps the burden of identity itself. And yet, his body didn't stay silent forever. Centuries later, his preserved remains challenge what we think we know about purity, history, and isolation. Japan's story, like every nation's, is more entangled than it appears. This man's DNA is proof of that. His presence in a rural tomb rewrites the neat timelines of textbooks. It's a reminder that the first threads of globalism weren't drawn by maps or trade agreements, but through people, quiet, unnamed, often forgotten. Long before global travel was common, before we saw the world as interconnected, one man carried the map of two civilizations inside his DNA and chose to spend his last days in silent spiritual transformation. Now, centuries later, we finally understand what he took to the grave. Thanks for joining us on this journey through time, science, and identity. If you find meaning in stories where DNA reveals lost lives and forgotten truths, consider subscribing. We have many more untold chapters waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep listening to the voices history tried to silence.